Okay, we can start.
Should we go on? Should we start?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just open my document here. No. One more thing I need to open, and we're starting officially. We have a new description on our website, so I had to open it. Okay, so welcome everybody to this first opening lecture seminar, actually, in the series of open seminars this fall. This year we offer, apart from the habitual open seminars that are open to everybody, accessible for free, etc., that have been running since this last spring, we offer also intensive study programs for credit. That thing is, I mean, the enrollment process for that program is already over. It's finishing today. One of our partners, basically the Vienna Institute, the Vienna Faculty of Architecture at the technological universities, also offering a program that we will announce soon, as well as the critical inquiry lab at the Design Academy in Eindhoven, the Netherlands. All these are novelties, so I thought I should announce them before I present ourselves, SMR, and our speaker today, Vera Bühlmann, who is also one of the directors and founders of SMR. So SMR, or the School of Materialist Research, is an education and research collective. Just a second. A research collective that offers intensive study courses, seminars, special programs, and research initiatives that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities from Skopje, the Department for Architecture, Theory, and Philosophy of Techniques at the Technical University Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven, and serves as a global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the intersection of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. So moving on, we should present today's speaker. Vera Bühlmann is one of the directors of SMR and its founders. She's also, as I said in the beginning, she's also a professor of architecture theory at Vienna University of Technology, where she directs the research unit Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Techniques, ATTP. Together with Ludger Hofstadt and Elias Zafiris, she founded and co-directs the digital mnemonics. I'm sorry if I pronounce it in Greek, it's easier. Mnemonics research group between Technical University Vienna. I guess this is the Technological University in Zurich, or what is ETH? Never mind, Zurich and Athens University. Among her latest publications are her monograph, Information and Mathematics in the Philosophy of Michel Serres, Bloomsbury 2020, as well as Entwurf of the Method and Ethics of its Discourse, Notes on Cartesian Rationalism Reconsidered in the Digital Continent, Anarchic Civility, Metaphysics of Copiousness, Technical University Academic Press 2021. That's forthcoming. Ethics of Coding, a report on the algorithmic condition with Felicity Coleman, Iris van der Tuin, and Aislinn O'Donnell. That's Edinburgh University, I guess, Horizon 2020. So photosynthesis in philosophy today, and atomic time and quantum literacy, Michel Serres, Apologia for Science, forthcoming with Minnesota Review 2021. I don't think I should take any more of your time by presenting the abstract of Vera's talk. It's available on the website. You have the chance to go through it. She will present it here as well in more length, of course. This is just an abstract, unless you want me to read it, Vera, or it's unnecessary.
It's fine.
Okay, because it will last longer. Okay, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Katerina. It's a pleasure that our open seminar starts again. I will share my screen. Good. So I want to start actually with the abstract, because I decided on rather short notice to do not exactly what I had intended to do, but to be more free in how to do this lecture. So the title of my talk remains valid: Materialism and the Public Nature of Knowledge. Michel Serres, Circumstantial Universalism. Yeah, maybe I read it quickly so we have the lineup of what is going to follow. So for you to have the full picture, maybe I say the strategy. So I wrote this one article which was just published this weekend with the title In Medias Naturae. It is for a journal, Media Theory Journal. Yeah, with just this title, and it is actually the manuscript I wanted to share in this lecture. But also, since it's published now, I decided not to go for the manuscript, but rather to read only excerpts from it and talk and bring to the table stories and indexes of what forms the cosmos, let's say, of this interest at all. So the topic will be, on the one hand, Michel Serres, but I really want to emphasize that my interest is not really to be a Michel Serres scholar. No, I have been concentrating a lot on the work of Michel Serres, simply for the reason that he is one of the very few philosophers today who attend to a physics of information in a way that doesn't directly continue one of the strong legacies in epistemology, let's say, that have formed throughout the 20th century. So he helps to see things together in a way that I find extremely interesting, because it's very, it's quite unique. He is widely known as a philosopher of science, literature, and especially perhaps communication. But his philosophy is before all a natural philosophy, a veritable communicational physics. And this gives you the index. So what I'm going to talk about is the relation between what we could call a dialectic philosophy and a natural philosophy. A natural philosophy is not a category that is very strong today. It was basically, put ad acta, we could almost say, with Newton's approach to philosophy and to physics. But there are good reasons for getting interested in what that used to be. That is my point I want to make. So this talk explores how to reconnect Serres' neo-materialist thought of what I call the circumstantial universalism, not only with ancient atomism of Lucretius, so this refers of course to one of his famous books, The Birth of Physics, in the poetry of Lucretius, but also with the pre-Socratic monisms of Anaximander and Pythagoras. Especially these two, Anaximander and Pythagoras, they sought to mathematize the different approaches of their teachers, so the pre-Socratic teachers, Thales and Heraclit and so on, and also their peer scholars who thought of nature as physis in the sense of a material, an elemental primary body, like water, fire, earth and air. My argument will be that the mathematization here is abstract, but still pre-formal in the sense of pre-axiomatic. And precisely in this, it is computational in a way that bears a great actuality for how we can come to terms with computation today. Especially Anaximanders' accommodation of mechanics within a materially circular or circuitous kind of, also a percolative mode of being, which was standardly called the meteora or meteorology. It's now translated in antiquity. This bears many clues that we can learn from for today's setup of logistics. No? So I didn't write this here, but what I mean with the circuitous self-referential logics that manifests in the digital environment is actually not really a logics, it's a logistics. Yeah? So it's a web of indexes, of interlinkages. It is the second part that I will not focus on so centrally, but you can read this in the article. It is published online and open access. So, as a motto of this universal circumstantialism, or a circumstantial universalism, is this quote here. It is from Michel Serres' late book, The Incandescent. Does an intelligence of things exist, of living things? Does the natural, as though in dormancy, prepare the cultural, in labor or in luminescence? The world's background noise murmurs like a pre-cogitat. So this sounds a bit cryptic, but it is very important to understand a categorical reset that Serres' whole thinking and the thinking that I am interested in lives from. And it says, we need to think about knowledge before the background of non-knowledge. Yeah? And my interest is that in this form of negation, it is not properly a logical negation. It involves metaphysical gestures, and I would say it is an architectonic relation, knowledge and non-knowledge, with like entropy and negative entropy. It doesn't give a positive referent on either side of this relation, but it's crucial to bear both sides of the relation present, not co-present. And this is, so knowledge not directly in relation to truth or to tradition or to a field of expertise, but knowledge in relation to non-knowledge. This is where what I call the publicness of knowledge resides, which is in my title, no? The public nature of knowledge and the materialism that can help us to think this through. But what to do with this? How to approach this? First, I want to give you the way of thinking that I'm learning from Serres of how he relates to this. I will read just this one page of my text as a kind of a motif that you can keep in mind for making links with respect to what follows. So publicness, how to speak about publicness. Serres proposes as a screening plot of ecstatic epiphany. And this is a complicated sentence, obviously. Ecstatic means not quite being oneself, but epiphany implies a kind of an immediacy. And this relation is precisely what I'm interested in. So I will read this one page, so we are all on the same page with regard to where we want to go. In Michel Serres' late book, The Incandescent, the first chapter is entitled Le Grand Récit. Serres' récit is not called grand only in terms of scope and survey, as in Lyotard's grand narratives, but also in those of magnitude and measurement. It begins with the depiction of the plot that this récit is to unfold, and this unfolding is to happen circuitously, in the sense of repeatedly spoken, repeatedly read, affectively received. It is a plot that relies upon depiction rather than telling or writing. In Serres' book, the depiction of this plot unfolds as a screaming scene of revelation, a scenery which is not properly poetic nor dramatic in the modern prosaic sense, nor is it a topos or a motif in the artistic technical sense of rhetorics. Rather, Serres speaks of this plot as the site of an ecstatic epiphany. This means first and foremost that his passage is to let a peculiar scene emerge before the inner eye of the reader. No? This is ekphrasis. So, and before the inner eye of the reader, in a peculiar manner that combines the tradition of the ars memoria, so memnotechnics, with the rhetorical art of ekphrasis. Ekphrasis in ancient rhetorics was a kind of a technique of how a speaker or a writer could write such as to evoke a certain picture in the head of the reader or the listener. So it's not a question of illustration or representation. It's a question of engendering, we could say, but an abstract kind of engendering. An ekphrasis does not lend itself so well to put in place and store one's thought. Rather, inversely, it aims at emptying out the very place occupied by one's thought, in order to render present an ideation that is neither properly one's own, nor that of anybody else in particular. Serres' passage does not speak about the insight, the content, or the message of such a revelation. Rather, it adopts a viewpoint of treatment with respect to the site where all of this happens. And it considers revelation as the inverse to the art of remembering. So the art of remembering is on the one hand memnotechnics, but it has these relations to anamnesis as well. And this, to keep these distinctions apart is what interests him. In a way such that revelation is going to be complementary to the art of memnotechnics. So revelation becomes the complement of an art of remembering, in that it facilitates an art of forgetting. This is all very abstract. Let's look very concretely at the scene that Serres is referring to when he develops all this. I cite from The Incandescent. This is how the book begins, actually. At the end of the lane, rising through the forest, positioned on a tall grassy hillock, surrounded by a torrent descending from the mountain, a farm and its annexes overlook a cirque dominated by glaciers. Beneath the morning sun and the motionless air, this view, this landscape, this scene revealed to me in an ecstatic epiphany the quiet presence of the things in their exact place. Transparent and white, space here seems to swallow up time, suspended. Think of this as a kind of a key, no? An Schlüsselbund or something like that. Of any, yeah, obviously until now quite enigmatic formulations. But what is important is, so it's an we have a landscape, a depiction of a landscape which embodies a kind of a cascadation of different durations. No, we have the timescales of the glaciers, we have the timescales of the house, we have the timescales of the river, which is continuously moving, and all of these durations, in the way that Serres refers to them, they are contingent upon one another. They are also nested. There is a hierarchy between these durations, but they have a certain integrity. They keep to themselves in the coexistence among the other durations that together form this site. And the kind of insight, or he calls it the revelation, the kind of the inner picture that can emerge has to do with thinking this contemporaneity of different time scales in this manner. This is also what the Grand Récit refers to. So the Grand Récit is the proposal of how we can think about the nature of the universe. So in astrophysics, we have a kind of a positive language, no? To speak of the Big Bang, to speak of the age that we attribute to certain planets, to the appearance of life forms, and so on. All of these is a positive language, which gives us dates, it gives us amounts of years, and so on. And these ages, or these dates, they are very, very importantly calculated with the reference to light speed. And light speed is a constant value, which is derived basically relative to a sun. Yeah? And the sun that's the point which makes it so interesting for a materialist point of view. A sun, what we have in a sun is the coincidence of light and mass. So from a physics point of view, a sun is the heaviest body there is in a galaxy, but at the same time, it is all light. And this coincidence of light with mass, and that is not yet matter. I will come to this. So this makes complicated what we mean with matter. But the physics of light, this is what informs all of the thinking of Michel Serres. And the Gradual C is circular, not like a sermon which we need to repeat and repeat and repeat, no? But it's precisely in order to facilitate something like an art of forgetting. And this art of forgetting has a lot to do with values that have become, I mean, they are central for science, but they have become a bit like a farce in the later discourses, the later, I don't know, post-war discourses, which means that there is something about knowledge which is not properly subjective, yeah? And it might not be properly objective either. That, of course, makes it all complicated, but there is something which cannot be reduced to a social constructivism or an individual constructivism. So that is the realism side to which Serres holds on to. In my understanding, what I call the circumstantial universalism is an interlinkage between a rationalist metaphysics on the one hand and a realism on the other hand. This is how I understand the natural contract in Serres. The natural contract is a book which is becoming very popular in relation to the Anthropocene. And what it says is we always need to first think a relation of equivalence, so not equivalence or equality, between the rational and the real with regards to knowledge. So an equivalence, they need to be of the same force, power, strength, and validity. And of course they are not. That's precisely why the rational needs to develop calibrated with the real, but the real needs to grow more accommodative relative to what the rational can rationalize and reproduce. So neither the subject nor the object pole are in any way fixed or in a hierarchy in relation to each other. Good. So then, how can we say that this grandness, no, is not just one in terms of importance or authority or validity, but actually in terms of magnitude and measurement? How can we make sense of this sentence here, the quiet presence of things in their exact place? So to begin to relate to this, and this might perhaps explain a little this difficult term that it's indeed hard to pronounce, no? The gnomon, what we have in mind in our research with digital gnomonics. What I show you here is the 9th book of Vitruve, which is dedicated as a whole to the gnomon, so to gnomonics. And the way that he starts is very significant for how we want to relate to it. Namely, I won't read this, you can read it, you can look it up. But what he is saying is that, no, Vitruve is every one of the 10 books, he is writing introductions that are kind of Geleitbriefe, you know, or like instructions, or what is this book, what is it going to do, for whom is it going to be relevant, and why should it be relevant? So there is a political, an activist, we could even say, aspect to how all of these books are introduced. And this book here begins by saying it has been a very long and common custom for all the cities to celebrate the athletes, to celebrate the sports people. So because the famous athletes, they create an identity, a political identity in a way that can hardly be achieved otherwise, because they demonstrate to everyone that it is possible to go further, to go always further than what feels already real, no? Then what can be achieved, and what we know that it can be achieved. So there is a kind of a moral model character to the athletes, and it has been deeply integrated, of course, in the cults to celebrate the athletes when they win, or also when they lose, and so on, as a public kind of festivity. And what Vitruve here says that yes, this is all right, this is also important, but how come? Why do we not do this for people who don't demonstrate, no, who basically become gymnasticians of thinking? Why don't we do this for people like Thales or like Archimedes? Why don't we do this specifically for mathematicians who, by some kind of mental gymnastics, are capable to grasp things in a way that they are connected, which will help everybody who knows of it. Yeah. Why don't we celebrate this kind of excellence in the same way? Because, of course, every nation, every country, every city, all political acts crucially depend upon precisely this. And that is at the core of what we are interested in. So there is a kind of thinking at work in mathematics, which we are no longer used to refer to. So it has become, since the 19th century, and Hegel played a huge role in that, it has become quite normal for us to think that in mathematics, everything goes mechanical and totally determined, whereas only in language we can think. And this is what the tradition I point out here kind of goes counter. Yeah. So of course it's true that in mathematics everything is determined, but it's not of one uniform systematic nature. And this introduces a capacity to think which is crucial. And this non-uniform body, so this not systematical construct, this is what the gnomon stands for. The gnomon is a kind of a device. I mean, it's the stick which gives the shadow at noon, so it's a sun clock, but it's a kind of an object which stands behind every notion of countable time and measurable space. It's something like Serres calls it the objective transcendental, no? And it's an object. The objective transcendental is an object which stands behind those very profound notions of measurement in terms of time and of space, and counting in terms of time and space. But it is not fixed in what it can do, because it works through an interplay between memnotechnics. So this is the collection of the data that the shadows cast, no? the collection of the data and the organization of the data according to forms. That's the memnotechnic part. And then the operations that can be reproduced in linking up this data. This is what Serres addresses as the algorithmic. So the gnomon constitutes an interplay between memnotechnics and algorithmics that is transcendental, but it's a transcendental which is objective. It is not anchored in the nature of the subject's cogito. It is not anchored in the faculties that would be genuine to human thought or to any other kind of thought. So it is about, from the very start, it is about an artificial kind of intelligence. And this artificial status relates to knowledge in the sense of knowledge being public. So it is not about directly making the connection between knowledge and truth. It's about the political, it's about the public, it's about what I call the architectonic aspect and dimension of it. So this is the gnomon. And now what we do with the digital is, I need to get rid of this Balken here. Yes, okay. Now what we do with the digital, of course, is not only concerning the material, the physical world outside, but it's very much about psychological. It's about issues of consciousness, of awareness, of learning, and so on. There is a book to which I will come back in a moment. It is actually a novel written by an artist, Helen Martin. It's called The Boiled In Between. So I will pick this up later, but I want to put here again as another motto of what is at stake. So this kind of gnomon with the digital also turns inward, not only outward. And Helen Martin speaks very aptly, as I think, of instruments of psychic observation. No? And this is the crucial point here, I mean, is it's instruments of psychic observation. So it's a question of an optics. It's not a question of an empathizing or of an understanding or of an Einfühlung or of something such. It's not an aesthetic category. It's a methodic category. It's an objective one. And it's one that works through exterior handlings. So through instruments. Yeah. Those instruments, if we take the view of those instruments, she says, we are not the moral function of behavior, neither analyst nor pulse. We are spectator, servant and clown. We are animal, vegetable, mineral. Our flight takes us everywhere. And the energy she develops from this is to say, we are interested and we are speaking. We will see that her novel is composed in a very peculiar way, to which I will come back a bit later. But for now, this is what I find very important. So to be interested no longer primarily means to be writing and reflecting and commenting and participating in a discourse that is always already territorialized to the degree that we have it today, but to actually return to an act of speaking again, of talking. And this talking, of course, creates a kind of a presence, and that is what we need to find a way of relating to. So most of my slides will be about that. Another motto here, a postcard, and take care to notice that it's a signed postcard of the Earth from the moon. So this is an image which for me stands very symbolical for this kind of objective transcendental, you know, that we can have with the gnomon. So there is a kind of an in-between, let's say, a bridging of spheres. They're not of the same order, and yet they are of the same nature, if we change to the point of view of a physics of the universe. So that's what I mean with a motto. I take this from a course that we offer in Vienna. It's offered by Chris Arguel. It's also her design. As talking throughout a surface. Yeah? So how to think of such a surface? This is crucial for the notion of percolation, or of different durations, you know, that they're not sealed off from each other. So the river, of course, transports the rocks, which creates the floors where the house can stand, but the rocks, they come from the glaciers. So how can we keep track of these nestings of temporalities in an objective sense? It always means to go through some kind of surface, so there is a kind of a trans movement, a breaking through, but it's not a movement that would properly be addressable through a logics of negation or affirmation. That is my point. But how then? So let's, I will just scroll through the table of contents. The history of Greek philosophy. This one is about the early pre-Socratics and the Pythagoreans, to recall some of the core ideas with this metaphysics of the primary body, or the elementary bodies of things. Okay, now I was too fast. So what I'm interested in is mostly Anaximander. But to give you, so what you had were like competing. So metaphysics meant you have a doctrine, but the doctrine didn't really compete with, I mean, it did compete with the others, but in a way that they can all grow stronger from relating to themselves. So whether you say everything comes from fire or everything comes from water, you can learn the gestures of the abstractions from each other and develop an own thinking in an interplay with those things. What makes Anaximander very special is that he introduced a notion which suggested to abstract from the decisions, where you would either go for one of the elements or for all of the elements in a particular order or something such. And instead he introduced a very abstract notion which he called the apeiron. It means it's the unbounded. And it's the notion in which he says we need to count with it. We need to take it as real in order to study the transformations among the elements in a way that we know from meteorology. No, in meteorology, everything goes in cycles. So the water which comes through the rain gathers in the seas, becomes dust, informs the winds transport all sorts of things. Yeah, so all we have in meteorology is cycles on scales that are not independent of one another, but there is not one hierarchy that would somehow demarcate the beginning or an end. So this is what he is interested in, and to reason formally and logically about the transformations of the elements in the condition of the meteora. For this, he created this abstraction of the apeiron, which is it's an abstract notion which can accommodate the void or something which is not there. So it's a bit like the zero in algebra. No, if we think of the zero through ontology, it is complicated because we would end up with an ontological notion of nihilism, which has severe moral implications. But if we say there is a sign and a symbol for it with which we can think without positively knowing what it is, it's another game. So it's the game of exterior treatment, which says we keep the right to reserve the truth that is at stake in it from totally revealing itself in what we can rationalize with it. We will see then that from this there are processes that are very interesting and important to think through data and through the digital. And these processes have to do with what is called rarefaction and condensation, because these two are not continuous, they're not continuous transformations, they are parts of the elements which kind of cast off and adopt an autonomy. They become something else. No, like the distillation of aromas, we can describe in this way, or the fabrication of perfumes and so on. So it's a kind of a transformation which is involved with newness, or with things that are not that don't reproduce themselves on their own, let's say. But how now can geometry, of all things, possibly have something to add to how we could measure such processes of qualitative transformations? What I show you here is a schema, of course, where you have the inclination angle of the sun, and you have a kind of a sphere. So let's call it the sphere, the climatic zone of the Earth. The sun reflects in certain angles, and the reflections, or the meteora, all these transformative processes, they happen here, yeah, below, so above the Earth and below the astronomical sky, yeah. So within a kind of a sphere, but of course there are meteors falling to Earth, so they're not independent, and lava and magma and things that go on below the surface of the Earth, they inform the transport of the minerals. So there is never a question of sealed off spheres, they are always all percolating through each other. But we can model with the gnomon, with geometry in this domain. But if we want to generalize from what we can model, it gets again more complicated, because in the different parts, no, this is now in a very small area of the world, but it was in antiquity an important one. You see that the inclination angles, of course, are not the same. So you can't generalize. No? So this is the problem of synchronizing time. And with synchronizing time, of creating maps of the Earth. So this comes much, much, much later than reasoning through forms and through geometry. As long as we say the gnomon gives us these kinds of forms as an objective transcendental, so as an instrument which gives us this, and we say whether there is an ideality and the truth of this ideality or not, let's keep the right to remain silent about that. What we are confronted with through such thinking is a notion of a space which is nested, which nests many different scalarities. I call them scalarities. So they are scales, like in the meteora, that don't correspond to the dimensions in a coordinated space. So there is a notion of scalarity where the translation between numbers and form, so between harmonics, so arithmetics, Pythagoras, and form, geometry, are in interplay with each other without having an absolute notion of space. Scalarities that can help us to address objects. What you see here is drawings from Le Corbusier, who was totally thinking about all of these things. And that to me was a great surprise when I started to actually read his own texts and not only read how art historians place him. So he has this one book, it's called The Poem of the Right Angle. And this is fantastic because the poem of the right angle, so the right angle is this core idea in geometry when we translate it into logical forms. But what he does is to relate it to poetry, no? Because he says with the right angle, precisely for reasons like these, we never get a clear space, but we are in a tropical space. We are in a space where things can morph into each other. No? So we are in an absolute space which is constructed a bit like the equator. And the equator, these terms, they're also symbolically speaking, because it means around the equator there is a kind of a homogeneity where things can yeah, it goes too far, no, with the tropes. So there is an interesting way of relating the figures in poetics, a trope, for example, to the geography and the thinking that went into the names that give us geography. So then, now I want to change register a little bit and speak about the same thing, but in a different setup. What you see here is from the Ars Electronica this year. It's a present that I got last week from a friend. What you see is a picking up of the problem of Augustinus, who formulated it as a serious intellectual problem that we need to think about how many angels can dance on the top of a needle. No? So there seems to be nothing less useful than something like that. But there are very interesting ideas related to it. Let's see how he describes his project. But he says, so this is the artist. The project is called the House of Angels. What he begins to consider is that data storage with DNA and the symmetries, the repetitions of the symmetries, kind of capture or perhaps are capable of conserving that which the scholastic people were relating to when they were speaking of angels. That sounds very far-fetched at first, but if you think about what the argument about this needle dance really entailed, it becomes super interesting, because the question that they were pondering is, angels are fallen, at least some of them, yeah? And if they are fallen, they must have a mass, they must have a body. No? So they must somehow participate in the place of gravities. But how can we think this? Because they don't have a visible presence. They don't have a visible presence. And this thinking, this thinking relates a lot to how we can keep co-present different durations. If we say they are different velocities, they don't sum up to one overall time. They coexist. No? So we have something similar. We have something physical, evidently, with the different durations of the glacier and of the rocks and of the life of the people there and of Serres telling this story, for which we don't have forms and formulas to address. I mean, this project is a bit polemical. It ends then, of course, with a kind of a very straightforward message. It says, in our time of problems, we might do very well if we can get this project that can keep 2.417 quintillion angels on the head of a pin. Yeah. So, but it's about reactivating stories. And what I do find interesting is that there is a way of concrete problem that can be addressed to in topics like these, like the other mathematical topics, which is the squaring of the circle or which is the doubling of the cube. They are not problems that were ever meant to be solved. They were something like repositories of gestures of metaphysical thinking in order to puzzle about something that is tremendously unsettling, no? And that cannot easily be captured. So when Serres makes this the motto of his thinking, does an intelligence of things exist, of living things? Does the natural, as through in dormancy, prepare the cultural in labor or in luminescence? The world's background noise murmurs like a precogita. Of course, he's raising the question of agency of things, which has become very predominant. But this agency of things has a material, a physical side of it as well, because the way that we can design objects, that we create technological artifacts, is reasoned through information technology. And information in this sense is a mathematical notion. No? It's not a semantical attribute or something like that. It's a physical, a mathematical notion which relates to the mass and energy. And it is totally generic. Yeah? So the citation, I think I kept it out now, which is really a kind of a key passage to this, to say that we need to return to a universalism. This is there, because there is no thing existing, whether organic or inorganic, that is not engaged in sending, in receiving, in storing, and in treating or processing information. Yeah? Whether we speak of pebbles, or whether we speak of photovoltaics, or whether we speak of a book, or whether we speak of a person, or whether we speak of animals, or populations of animals, or populations of human beings, on whatever set theoretical level of generality we are talking, always the object that is at stake is engaged in such an economy of information. And this economy of information involves now a physics for which we have at the moment primarily only a mechanics at stake, at hand. So in quantum mechanics, we are on the level of a mechanics. We are not yet on a level of a systematization of it. And philosophy needs to live up to this. It needs to speak and to develop, to re-articulate its core questions around the status quo of today's technology. And this is quantum optics and quantum mechanics. So that's the idea. Now, this sounds super abstract. I showed you here Le Corbusier, that's already almost 100 years old. So the topics to relate to the status of science in the arts on that level is not at all recent. It has already been here for 100 years. We rarely attend to it, but we can, and we could. It's similar when we go to poetry. So when we engage with what Paul Celan was proposing with his poetics of the meridian, so you can think of the meridian, we talked about the equator, so the Earth as a geographic abstract construct around the equator with the two poles. The meridian is the line which links the two poles and gives us the standard for the world time. So for the, what is it called? London is the anchor points to calibrate the logistics of the time today. But the meridian itself is an abstract projection. It's a bit like the apeiron, except it's directly instrumentally operated upon, but it's a bit like the apeiron. It doesn't exist. We could make another meridian, it would work as well. But what the meridian now does, together with the equator, which is also, of course, an abstraction, is it can have a line of the continuous transformation, which goes around the equator, where there is a kind of a stable climate zone, crossed through an abstraction that generalizes the places along the equator to expand around the whole world. But there is not one meridian that can do this. The meridian itself becomes an operable category, we could say, that can thwart the continuity of the transformation processes. And this is what gives Paul Celan the opportunity to not be nonsensical when he starts to say we need to introduce totally new words into poetics. We can't directly continue the canon of the forms that we owe to the time before everything became literature, which was basically no earlier than Enlightenment. So before you had all the genres had a very intricate set of instruments, an instrumentarium of how to relate to things. So this is the domain of the philologists. And then in a broad generalization, suddenly everything becomes fiction and literature. And we have lost a huge instrumentarium. And what Paul Celan invites us is to readopt this instrumentarium, but think it now inversely as well. So like when Serres says knowledge before the background of non-knowledge, poetics before or in relation to non-poetics. This would be with the meridian. So he introduces the ideas of how could we write prose where we are not just trying to find words to capture what we want to say, but when we try to depict the situation of a word through a counter word, a Gegenworten is his term. It gets a bit obscene almost when the German words are translated into English, because in English these terms are so totally technical, whereas in the German, they have a different life world, let's say, at least if you're a German speaker. But it is, of course, the technicality that is at stake. So there is a very interesting outlook to relate to this. And the person who has picked this up most is a philologist. Indeed, it is Werner Hamacher. Here with a short book, which give the word, and again, relate this to the data of astrophysics. So what physics tells us about the universe is that the world is given. Yeah. But how can we keep open what that means? This is the thrust that this kind of philology brings to it. It's a classicism, but not one that wants to fight about the true origin and the pure first appearance of things, but rather to model any appearance of the things through this counter gesture, through this inversion. So give the word is his statement. I have one short passage which makes, I think, quite clear how this relates to this digital economy of information, let's say. He says the elements of language explicate one another. No? And we can think of the meteora like this as well. So the elements of physics explicate one another. They speak for that which still remains to be said within that which is said. They speak as philological additions to one another. Language is archiphilology, precisely because there keep coming new additions. No? This is like nature and artifacts. Every artifact, even plastic, is chemistry, you know, it's nature. Yeah. So how can we relate between the two poles of nature and artifact or culture? A bit like, that's why I'm so interested in the meridian and the equator and in these world models. A bit like the North Pole and the South Pole. No? What if the artifact would be a North Pole and what we call nature would be a South Pole? And the world is everything in between. Yeah? It's of both. There is not one position, there is not one thing of the world which does not also belong to the other pole. So this is what it means to think in spectra. This one here goes further. It says the elements of language explicate one another. They offer additions to what has hitherto been said. They speak for one another as witnesses, as advocates, and as translators that open that which has been said onto that which is to be said. The elements of language relate to one another as languages. There is not one language, but a multiplicity, not a stable multiplicity, but only a perpetual multiplication of languages. The relation that the many languages within each individual language and all individual languages entertain to one another is philology. Philology, the perpetual extension of the elements of linguistic existence. So this is an understanding which is, first of all, entirely algebraic, like the digital code is algebraic, in the sense that for every positive thing, there is a positively graspable negative thing. Yeah. So how do we think of such negation? How do we think of such negation? It is much more a kind of a negation that works like in sculpture, where you produce a negative form that will cast the multiplication of something, that gives the form negatively. There is another book by Hamacher, which is, I picked a German one here. The title would be With, Without, With. Yeah, so it's the discretion that happens upon continuous transformation that is interesting with regard to it. And here he has a text specifically on the figure of negation in Hegel, how it works, where he makes the case that we need to think of negation, so das Nichts, the void or nothing, within the phrase of identity. No? And the phrase is that the German word is der Satz der Identität. So in English, it would be the principle of identity or the law of identity. So it refers to propositions and to logics. And Werner Hamacher's whole argument is that a phrase or a sentence is not coextensive with its propositional form. And every propositional form must be read as a phrase, which then can be modeled again as a proposition. So there is, he maintains a relation between writing and speaking in that, which refuses the distinction in a natural language and a formal language, no, which has become predominant in epistemology. So this he refuses, and instead he says there is an equi-fertilization, we could say, no, between the two. But they are different aspects, like the real and the rational in Serres. So the coincidence, that's all of these are ideas of how can we think a notion of the circumstantial universalism, no? A universalism which allows, which lives basically from also coincidences. In Hammacher, this translates directly into how we can think place. So when I say this, the status, the nature of knowledge as public knowledge, this nature must somehow have a relation to space and time, of course. No? With time, we already saw that. The time is being these nested durations that all coincide, that all coexist in a site, which allows for what Serres calls a descent into time, as well as a planning, which of course is the ascent. So in the planning, we do the same thing, but towards the future. What the thinking of that Serres introduces to opens up is that the same can go in the past as well. And it's not history which this produces. No? It's not history, because there is never a necessity of one thing following from the other. How Hammacher relates to this is through the notion of place, and he says place is the jointure, die Fuge of things. There is a little bit of an elaboration of this term, die Fuge. No, it's a term which, of course, is famous from musical composition. A fugue is itself a fugue, a place. It means a cleft and a juncture, and joins and divides juncture and cleft. So it is an interplay that thinks a kind of a remoteness or a proximity, which are spatial notions, but in their qualitativeness. That is the important thing. So here, when we say here and now, this moment, this indexical, what we articulate is a jointure of places. No? This here, you bring everything that you all bring, so it's all part of the place where we are. So basically, what he discusses here is something we have learned to relate to through Zoom in a very drastic way in the last month. But what Serres has been talking about, that this is actually not the digital versus the analog world, but the analog world accommodates such a digital physicality all along. Okay. One more figure which is helpful to think this through. No? So then how do we think of such a place? So what would be the spatial notion? Because it must be a kind of a container. So otherwise we couldn't speak of a space. But what kind of a container? Hammacher brings in place a notion that, of the amphora. No? And we could say the amphora is something like the voluminosity or the architectonics of a metaphor. No? So what if metaphors become objects? And what he says is an amphora is such a device because it is bounded. So it's like the duplication of Anaximanders apeiron, because it is unbounded by being bounded twice. So it bounds towards the inside, a space that can contain nothing, but it bounds towards the outside against an infinity, with which it is both contingent, no? The void and the infinite. The amphora is a form, it's a spatial form, an objective form, which is contingent with the void and with the infinite. And that's where its formality is constituted from. His suggestion is to think of place in terms of such a kind of an amphora. And what I am so excited about is that this links with mathematics, with contemporary mathematics, that goes beyond the logicist debates, the formalist debates around set theory and category theory and their epistemological implications, but that actually work out a kind of a mathematical thinking, no? A mathematical thinking through natural communication, or physics as a communication, and what is the mathematics in relation to it. I can't go through this. I see that time has already advanced a lot, but I want to give you some indexes. So it's the epistemological topics, of course, are all central. It's about deduction, it's about induction, but it's also about abduction. It's about dissociation, association, but also metaphora. It's about abstraction in relation to invariance, which basically gives us a way to measure and to control actually percolation processes. Always in a model domain. In a model domain that doesn't try to represent something, but to make it rationalizable. But then this model needs to be calibrated with the real. They are not. Then the model doesn't represent the real. It helps us to understand the real, and the real helps to develop the models. This is a kind of a contract. Yeah, with Serres, it's the natural contract that exists between these things. An easy figure of how we can think of this is to say that there are basically two very symbolical and archetypical situations, let's say. No? So we have seen this site of revelation with Serres, which is in the hills with the glaciers and everything. What would be an abstract pendant to this? The suggestion that Elias Safiris makes is, and I find it a very intuitive one. Think of the night sky and the temple as inverses. As inverses in the sense that when you are outside looking at the night sky, you cannot but make yourself the center of what you perceive. Yeah. Because the openness of this vastness, it can root in you as the center. It's inverse when you are in a universal order, in the space of a temple. There, what you cannot do is make yourself the center. Yeah. So these are categorical exclusives, we could say. But they are not, one is not right or wrong. The thing is, we can think their inverse relation through a mathematical notion of the analemma, which would be too much to go to now. But this is what Elias's mathematics is all about. Yeah, this goes too far. What is important is this notion of the diachronicity. Yeah, the diachronicity. So something which is not chronological and it's not dialogical. There's a nature of this percolation which involves the countable time, but countable times that nevertheless maintain a certain autonomy against, as a duration against all the others. My plan was to bring these lines together by reading another passage of the paper, but I'm not sure if we still have time. It would be, I guess, about 6 minutes.
Yeah, of course, why not? Yeah. Can stay a bit longer. Yes.
So then this kind of amphora space of a circumstantial universalism, no? It is where, in my understanding, architectonics can play an important role, because it can relate to this strange relation between space that suspends time. So this was the key moment in Serres' passage in the beginning, if you remember. So this site of ecstatic epiphany is a site where things appear to the quiet presence of all things in their exact place. So the quiet presence. Now this is an inverse thinking to harmonics. Yeah. So the quietness is like the stillness of a mechanical device. A mechanical device means every action you can produce, you need to be able to undo it. This is the moment of silence that this kind of forgetting can trigger. So the silent presence of things in their exact place. The exactness now relates to measurement. And there is one article which is entitled Exact and Human, where Serres develops this a bit further. And here I would like to give you an insight of how he does this as well. So he says, an architectonics of knowledge, that would be knowledge with respect to its public nature, so not knowledge as the whole truth, yeah? But truth is involved, but it's never exposed totally. It's a public nature. Space that keeps time suspended, like Chronos does, who swallows his own children. With respect to better grasping the ideation of such a mysterious plot, no? the plot of an ecstatic epiphany, to be reconstructed by a Grand Récit, we can best turn to Michel Serres' article Exact and Human. It depicts the domain of mediality as one of meteorological order. Meteorological order, since order is, mathematically speaking, a geometric notion, is Serres maintaining here that there could be a geometry of the weather. It is indeed a notion of geometry that is to take the weather into account. so this meteora transformation space. In his attempt to relate a rationalist metaphysics to realism, he is able to keep apart two separate paths of thinking place. And this is important for thinking place as public. No? So not a proper place, not an ontology, but a public place, one that is calibrated by the zero, by the void, by the point of a fulcrum, or a lever. At stake is, after all, a notion of place that can lodge knowledge as public knowledge. The treatment of such a notion of place is an exterior treatment. It involves geometry, but happens physically. It is a mechanical treatment in the old sense, that means in the pre-Newtonian sense, in the Archimedean sense, namely mechanics as an art. One path, and we can think method here, straddles the local and the global. The other straddles the place, le lieu, for which there can always only be placeholders, and the universe. It is a cryptographic Rosetta Stone reasoning that is hereby at work. We can trace patterns of inscriptions, but not knowing the alphabet, those patterns of inscriptions remain cryptic. So we need many documents to speculatively and philologically try to make sense of it. We can recognize constellations that appear to bear symbolic meaning, but without rationalizing these constellations, they remain hermetic. What opens up amidst this analogia is a space of likeness. So likenness, no? It's a space of similarity, but the similarities don't have a fixed reference point. No? It's like, so they inform, both poles inform each other. There is an interest in exterior handlings. This is what characterizes it as architectonics. Serres depicts in his text a mediate domain, namely a space of similitudes, as a milieu that does not properly belong to one metric space, but is rather the space of representation where things can be lodged publicly, at the cost of acknowledging that the truth in such knowledge cannot be identified exhaustively. So things always remain to be figured out. This is what constitutes the public. It is a space of similitude. It is even a geometric space, since there is a notion of order. Order is a geometric notion, mathematically speaking, but it is nevertheless one of mimesis, of aspiration, and of modeling. Relative to this, we gain a notion of order that is architectonic, but also schematic. So architectonic and schematic instead of ideal and form. So Serres elaborates. Here we have it. It's indeed a question of a homothetic standard and of conveyance, of increasing and decreasing. What it describes is the gnomon, of course. So it's a standard because it establishes a space of homothesis. So where two theses, so things which are put in place, maintain a relation of adequacy among each other. That's the decisive thing. Not the things are same, but they are in a proportionate relation. And what the standard does is not determine the proportionateness, but facilitate the conveyance. So an Übertrag, no? A kind of a transfer, like in metaphor. And there can be scaling across several scales. So what we need to figure out in this setup is not the two things which are put into homothesis, but what is the standard that establishes it? Yeah. So this is the architectonic thinking. What is the standard? What is the thinking that went into the conception of the standard in a particular position? Because the standard facilitates transfer. It facilitates generalization, but not a generalization that goes into an ontology or wants to accommodate in an integral way, but in an objective way where objects exist among objects, no? Without an overall systematical order, so a public space. I already talked about the negative form in the plastic sense, no? So it's like the casting form for producing sculptures. So the standard becomes a kind of a negative form. But this negativity is not a logical one. It is one that can engender. That is the interesting thing about it. Yeah? So it's nature and engendering don't contradict. They work together a bit like the non-knowledge and the knowledge. No? So there is not a relation of a representation between the two. There is a relation of, engendering in relation to. So the nature in Serres' thinking is this domain of the pre-cogitat. No? So the chaos, the atomistic chaos, is that which has not been thought. And thinking is not reserved to humans. Every rock thinks because it exchanges, stores, receives information. So physics is a process of thinking that happens materially. This is what he is talking about. And he says of such a reality, the space of similitudes, which is the core of geometry, but not axiomatic, not in the formalist sense of axiomatics, but in the device, in the instrumental sense of the gnomon, is indeed ordinary geometry. So in geometry, we have a loss of movement. Everything appears to be static, but that is only so a fragile balance established by a standard. And thinking the standard that establishes the space of likeness allows us to model space. No? And it gives us the spaces of models. And then, what does this apply to? No, something very, very familiar. It says this space of similitudes, well embedded in the chain of inclusions, well marked by the law of relations, where the local corresponds to the global, the space of representation and images, of shield and iconography remains, of course, a schema of ordering. And this ordering, I think I will make this a bit short now, again gives us a very concrete scene. The chain of inclusions, the space of similitudes, is structured by a relation of order, as for example, the house in the street, the little street in Gironde, the city in its province, Brittany in France, all of this non-reflexive, asymmetrical and transitive. Here is the structural order that can unfold in a Carillion arrangement of models. What is important is this part here, a structural order, because this is usually precisely what we love structure to free us from, order. No? We say in structure there is no hierarchy. In order there is always hierarchy. But when we include time, we get an understanding of space and place that is structural in order, in the way of this nestedness that we have here, no? In a real sense. And then how we can relate to this is through an instrument, the Carillion arrangement. So what we can get is a geometry that comes along like a scale, more in terms of numbers or in terms of a musical scale, that needs to be played by instruments. So we gain a notion of instruments in order to temper spaces when we measure them. No, it's a measurement of the temperaments, because it's always this meteora transformations in every space that we relate to. Yeah, maybe to close this, I want to pick up this one book that I was talking about earlier with the instruments of psychic observation. No? So when we are at this point with the instruments, this is the book by Helen Martin, The Boiled in Between. And what she does is she invents a lot of messieurs or messengers. No? It's not quite clear what they're called, but they always claim an exterior point of view for describing totally ordinary things. So we have a couple that is external and sunny. They describe an open sky situation. Some have proper names. They describe other things. Some are external and counting. They try to grasp a fish. Some are external and woody. They can tell us about glue, and so on. So it's a way that relates to the ordinary reality in a discrete way, which objectifies things and rationalizes them through narration without giving us a story. And this is a very powerful setup, I think, of relating to what I was interested in, namely a circumstantial universalism that one can learn to think with the philosophy of Michel Serres. Thank you, that was it.
Thank you, Vera. It was fascinating, just like your writing. All right, we have like 15 more minutes. Maybe we can go past our time, like until 8:15, and give more floor and time to the others. So who wants to say something? I think I saw a raised hand, but it's not raised anymore. Somebody got to try. Ah, yes, Helen.
Hello, thank you, Vera. I was wondering about, so I'm really fascinated by this. I need to read the Paul Celan to understand about this, the word and the counter word. And then when you related this to the sculpture and the idea of, so is the word and the counter word somehow, this is analogous to the this idea of the plastic negativity that you have in the sculpture. So yeah, my immediate thought was what would this plastic negativity be in language, in writing? So maybe, I don't know if Paul Celan has one way of thinking it, but I wonder, are there any other writers that you are thinking or have read who also might show this kind of, what this plastic negativity might be?
Yeah, for me, very strikingly, it's Peter Handke in the Bildverlust.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there he tries to, and it's always, but there must be many, no? It's always, I mean, the issue of time, how to relate in today's poetics or literary writing, how to yeah, find different tenses. No? So how to express the thickness of the contemporary, let's say, if we don't want to follow the canonics of the classics and this kind of hierarchical model, how to engage with the tenseness of time or the tempus of time that becomes accessible through literary grammars, maybe. I don't know. There must be many people looking for that. So for me, it has been, the return to literature has been quite recent, maybe 2 years. And between there were like 15 years where I did not follow any literature at all, because yeah, I tried to get out of the structuralism that is everywhere at work, and literature did not help to get out. But now that I am more out of it, I keep finding beautiful things in literature. Yes, there must be many places.
Okay, anyone else? Either raise your hand down there where this reactions button is, or just turn on your mic and start talking. Okay, let's wait a bit more. Okay, Lorenzo.
Hello, everyone, and I was wondering if at the really beginning you started with the duality there of knowledge and non-knowledge, and then I started to simply reflect, how can we push it really farther? Would you agree that we can bring this duality on the level of, I mean, towards the level on subject and object duality, so that somehow what you say, that knowledge and non-knowledge, they actually inform each other by somehow becoming public, by becoming publicness and public. So would you agree that we can say, and how could it become possible to bring the same relationship between knowledge and non-knowledge on the level of subject and object duality? And so this would potentially allow us to think about only about their relationship. So somehow subject and knowledge, the subject and object, they would disappear, and what stays, what remains, is their relationship, let's say the energy between them. And if this would be possible, then would you call this relationship somehow not, of course, a dialectical one anymore, but more as a matter of translation and as a matter of proportion, and so that then it becomes non-local and it can become universal?
Yeah, but I think it's a question, they're not on the same, so many subjects inform a notion of objectivity. many objects build a notion of subjectivity. So I think that it's like a chiasm, the relation. It's not, so we cannot just reduplicate it. So now I think we are, so when that's the interest with, is there an intelligence of things? So things become active subjects. They don't just have an agency, no, that can be operated in some meta level structure. That's my interest, my political interest. There is an agency of things, so they become active subjects, and they inform a notion of, yeah, not only inform, they operate, they work with a notion, or in the horizon of a notion of objectivity. But on the other hand, we have objects. If they are not calibrated within one horizon, they would be in the open night sky. Yeah. They exist in, yeah. And they can be informed, or the reasoning of their objectivity can be puzzled, or can be always opened up again through a corresponding notion of the subject. And I would say, yes, everything becomes a question of translation, but the translation alone doesn't help. It needs to have the metricity. That's the external treatment of the, what I call the transcription. And the transcription has to do with the notations. It has to do with the code, basically, with the writing in code of things. So this gives the transcription where we can translate things into each other at the cost of saying we can never claim an exhaustive knowledge about something, no? But we can contract a coexistence of things.
So it's the blending, according to what you say. It's the chiasmus, as you were saying.
Yeah, but the chiasmus is not a blending.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Anyone else? Lillian?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Vera, for this presentation. I just have a very quick question and want to pick up on something you just said now in the end concerning the structuralism, because I would be interested in what you think about about that in especially in Serres' work, because he they're also like people who read kind of a different structuralism, like based on like his reading of Lucretius and especially the work on Leibniz. And for sure, this is a very different structuralism than like linguistic structuralism or even like the idea of structure in post-structuralism. And I was just wondering how you would maybe label that, or whether you would say this is like we really have to get rid of the idea of structure at all when looking at the idea of model and translation and what you also just described.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. This is very important, and it's very difficult to talk about that actually. So I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with structure when we keep it where it is not an instrument of some kind, where it's just mathematical. No, this is algebra. It's linear algebra. So and it's topology. So it can do a lot of things there, but it's not enough to describe quantum mechanical processes as itself. No, we need higher levels of abstraction to go there. We need to engage with probabilistics and so on. And what Serres, I think in his book on Leibniz, which was the first book, what he actually does is to say, he says, so we cannot hope to systematize through the notion of structure. All we can get, if we really learn to think through structure, is to find constellations of concepts. And these constellations, they are, so this idea to turn to the constellations of the stars, and this, so to index, to relate patterns again to something like that, is actually to a large degree coming from Serres. It is what he calls the mathematical models. No? So then we make mathematical models of how we link up these constellations into hypotheses that kind of can make sense. And then we trace them and we try to make things with them. And like always in mathematics, no, you can do things that you have not planned, because you can't imagine that one could do this until you can do it. So it's a notion of thinking conceptually through constellations. And constellations, they are neither category nor set. They are kind of diachronic through them, no? And I would say diachronic, not dialectic, because they have an autonomous presence as these indexical points. They're not just present because somebody reads them. So it's a physics that should be calibrated again with mathematics, not mediated through logics that would exist now. So with structure, there is nothing wrong. The problem is with the isms, no? When you want to make a totality of structural thought. So then it gets, I mean, it's a bit like the angels on the pin of the needle, no? It has triggered an enormously fantastic and rich space of thinking. So I'm very fond of the structuralist and the post-structuralist in instruments and conceptions, but they're models. They're models.
So when I understand that correctly, it would really be that, yeah, there's nothing wrong with structure and also not structuralism, but the tendency to understand any sort of structuralism as one specific structure that is then imposed on everything, and not withhold kind of the multiplicity of formal structures itself is the problem with the term then.
Yes, and along with that goes, so structuralism always or often means that there comes a kind of a theory which forms a hierarchy between the different parts of mathematics. So between arithmetics, geometry, harmonics, and algebra. No? So, or harmonics and arithmetics are actually the same, no? To a certain, from a certain point of view. So that then suddenly algebra dominates arithmetics and geometry. No? Or if you're a formalist, geometry, axiomatics, it's no longer geometry then, it becomes logics, dominates algebra and arithmetics. So it's always about making a hierarchy between these different branches that are all mathematics, and they can all take a different position. No? They can put things in profile in a way that the others cannot. But it's not that one is true and the others are not. It's the interplay which facilitates an understanding of things. And with structure, just like with algebra, there is nothing wrong. It's super beautiful and powerful. But the idea of a tripod means that precisely three things like this, so like arithmetics, algebra, and geometry, no, they stand on insecure, so they need to stabilize each other. They are nothing without the others. They need to stabilize each other. And they can do that so that the development of the mathematical thinking can go the path that pushes geometry and it goes in a certain direction. It can go a path that pushes arithmetics, it goes in another direction. With algebra as well. And it always produces philosophical ways of thinking. And then they seem to hate each other and to be incompatible, but they can be translated into each other. That's what I find so fascinating about the mathematical thinking. The different positions can be translated through each other, no? Not to get an original message or the final message, but precisely as a way of a physics communication where they inform each other through what the others are doing, are capable of doing.
Yeah, thank you for the answer.
Okay. Anybody else? Checking to see raised hands. Okay. Well, the others make up their mind. I can quickly ask a question, maybe. Mm-hmm. Vera, you were talking about this equipolarity, right?
Equivalence?
Yeah. Between the real or realism, right, and rationalism.
Well, the real and the rational, yes.
The real and the rational. So yeah, they established this kind of equipolarity. So these are, let's say, in a way, different planes of reality. Let's put it that way. That can we put it that way? This my question. Like, you know, the immanence and transcendence, for example, in certain philosophies, like in Deleuzian, post-Deleuzian, we find the similar. Well, in Kant as well, I guess the transcendental vis-a-vis the outside world has a similar position. So, is it a little bit like this in the sense that the rational that seeks to relate to the real constitutes, inhabits a certain, let's put it, a plane of reality of its own. It's at there is this chasm between the two, but the two relate in a way to one another and are kind of the real, the rational still speaks of the real, even though not being the same as it, enmeshed with it. Is this in a way what you were saying, or?
Yes, but that would be only one way of the translation. No?
Of course, yeah.
So my interest is to say it always needs to go both ways.
Mm-hmm.
So when we identify, when we make a kind of an order of different planes of reality, this order itself can again be rationalized. And through rationalizing it, it symbolizes again what has become an order. No? So it's never positive, it's never absolute. So it's basically it's a pushing back of the notion of the absolute, no? Into the thickness of time, into the reality of time.
Okay, so yeah, I think I understand. Well, it reminded me of Aristotle and his intervention into, you know, pre-Socratic philosophy and, you know, the aporia, the impossibility of motion and time in Greek antiquity due to this Eleatic dictum, because if we allow for movement, that means that we allow for empty space, therefore we allow for nothingness. And the way that Aristotle resolves it, and he kind of says, it's not about how things are in reality, like in the tone, in the being itself. It's about how you put things, and you're asking the questions incorrectly. He says this in a way to his predecessors. To be more clear, let me just quote this. Two quotes from his physics. He says, one could not easily put motion and change in other genus. This is plain if we consider where some people put it. They identify motion with difference or inequality or not being, but such things are not necessarily moved. Whether they're different or unequal or non-existent. And then he continues, so some people say that the void is the matter of the body. They identify the place, so space, too, with this. And in this, they speak incorrectly. For the matter is not separable from the things, but they are inquiring about the void as about something separable. So he kind of develops further on an entire organ on how to think of this aporetic situation. So, you know, this establishment of, you know, two sets of categories, two planes of competing realities, yet one of human making, of course, yet in correspondence with one another. You reminded me of this intervention of Aristotle, so I wanted to read the quote. And it's interesting also to note that on the apeiron we will have several classes in the intensive study courses by Thomas, because he published the latest translation in English of Lucretius, so De Rerum Natura. So And he interprets the void and the apeiron very similar to your presentation here. So it will be interesting to compare the two.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else?
But maybe what I find interesting, so because if we try to find an ontological way of relating to the void, we can only, pick one school against another. And what I find so attractive about staying on this level of the abstractness, so with the philology, with the mnemonics, with always the condition of possibility for a notion of order or language or grammar or of things, is that is indeed to mobilize a certain schema for doing things without systematizing them. So this notion of a mechanics, which is prior to the idea of a system of physics. So a mechanics, which is an art, because in mechanics, you're always somehow dealing with the infinite and you have this point of the zero or of the fulcrum, which would be difficult to place ontologically, precisely. But we don't need to. If we have a positive and an exterior treatment of what is possible with formal thinking in such a mechanical sense. So for me, it's at least until now, this is how I'm fascinated with these abstractions, with these metaphysical things, and I call them then gestures. So I would relate them to what I'm interested in is in learning the gestures of thinking that follow from going with Democritus versus Lucretius, or with Anaximander versus Anaximenes, and so on. So to learn in a way, to build a body of thinking, And this body of thinking is that's another thing that I'm so interested in with the subject, perhaps, that you, Lorenzo, were asking about. It's not a personal one, it's an impersonal, but it's a body of thinking. It experiences, it's material, it's organized, but there's not one of it. So we inhabit a different body of thinking when we think in terms only of the real numbers and structure and linear algebra, than when we inhabit the body of abstractions that can sense and distinguish categories and sheaves and toposes and all these other forms. Or when we go with the natural numbers, where the 1 and the 2 and the 0 are not numbers at all. So so it's always a different kind of body, but they are not personal, they're not individual. They are natural, but they're not determined. They co-evolve with this kind of thinking. This is what I'm so interested in. That's what I care for.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Thanks. Andy has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, right.
Sorry. I have very, very fascinating. Thank you. I'm mostly new to most of the things you've referred to. I've read only this from Michel Serres, the crisis one, and followed a few of your things. But I will bring up, so I'm fascinated by this idea of amphora that you mentioned, where there's a void that turns inwards and the bound is tending towards infinity. Now, since it's all kind of pieces in my head, I want to ask about the thing that you end with, which is carillon arrangement, right? Carillon, am I saying it right? A kind of carillon arrangement of things.
Yes.
And in that sense, I think the part where you say that the night sky forces you to imposes a kind of centrality over the viewing subject, and the space of the temple. Okay, I'm an architect, so the space of the temple cannot be it sort of does the opposite, let's say. I would love to think about this a lot more, but I wanted to ask you something, maybe even silly, but here's my actual question. If we were to think about the culture, let's say, of cuisine and cooking right from its, in a Eames powers of 10 way, where we are talking about its chemical, physical processes, where also it's sort of cultural exchange throughout history. There's no linear idea of why a potato showed up in a specific continent at a certain time. Of course, okay, people moved, but we all know now that a lot of people moved a lot of places that conventional history didn't talk about. And then this space of the temple, or I don't know, either of them, where you are thinking about the centrality of the experience of eating. Would something like that even come close to any of your sort of very, very articulate methods of thinking about it? Because I find the range of the constant flux and flipping of background, foreground in all your descriptions extremely sort of rich for me to think. But I don't know, I just wanted to bring it up as a very silly observation, but I think it's quite an evolved culture.
So I would, with the cooking, I would, I think, yes, these are indeed the spaces of experience where we can find examples that can somehow at least express more of this kind of mixed transformations, no, and partial things. So where it actually crucially depends on very, very precise time, no? whether something works or not, whether it's So many durations that you need to tact and to plan with in a constellation way, not in a linear sequencing. It's not like in a factory, no? And you don't multilinearize as well. So it's really the whole composition, specifically in cooking. But where I'm very bothered, but I'm glad you bring it up, is the Eames space, because this is precisely what we need to get out of when we think these scalarities. So what happens in the Eames space is everything goes in an what would be the precise word?
Equidistant
of 10. So it's always the same exponent. It's one homogeneous kind of declination that goes through. And what I'm talking about with these nested durations that are contingent, they're totally different in terms of magnitude. So this is why the Grand narrative is one of the measurement of durations as well, because it cannot put a mean scale across all of these layers. No, then everything is lost. So you need to keep different scalarities at work and learning to tune them, to temper an instrument, let's say, or I don't know. So it's notions of cooking and of instruments, yes, specifically also musical instruments, and then gymnastics, of course. Yoga would also help, no? But it's So, but it's achieving of time-space balances in an intricate way that doesn't know an external kind of total calibration. No? So to put it in another way, so we are all gravitational people, to put a word that Ludger likes so much. We are all gravitational people, but we can also be quite lofty. Yeah. So the weight is not determining the whole domain of our experience. There is Simone Weil, I love her very much for this work with grace and gravity. No? And yes, you can say grace doesn't exist and so on, but I'm not interested in a materialism for which grace does not exist. So, no, yeah, gravity, yes, but the wind is material too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I agree about the grace of gravity.
You agree?
Of course.
That's great.
I know I look like I don't agree, but I actually agree very much so. We have Konstantin asking a question.
Oh. Am I heard? Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Yeah.
I'm also an architect, so I would try to ask maybe a very applied question, let's say. So this idea of kind of keeping the direct causality and teleology at bay, right? Like kind of keeping them in the air for the new modern, for the new method of thinking. So this new method of thinking kind of goes, of course, is misaligned with our immediate pattern of thinking that is very, how to say, within the modern crises and emergencies, it's an immediate one that we utilize, right? So it's also immediate one that it's also a historical one where we talk about our relationship with technology, or so on. So, and the question then is very simple: how this method of thinking can make itself seductive enough to this new method of thinking to integrate within such a critical point of time when when everyone is kind of grasping for what is at the closest expanse. And I understand that this new method of thinking is allowing us to navigate through what Michel Serres called Northwest Passage, right? And kind of operate within the technology and kind of on a new way, and technology becomes a different thing. But how can we make that step? How can we make this method of thinking apparent and more affordable and clear and seductive? Okay, I hope it made sense.
Yes, but you're asking almost a bit like, how can we save the world with this? I know there is a lot of talk now about the end of the world and that it's all in our responsibility. And this, I find it quite crucial. So this kind of thinking is more modest with regard to that. Yeah? So it can't be, it's not a problem to be solved. It can't, so this kind of thinking can precisely not facilitate, so basically it's doing the opposite. So whenever there is a problem, make a larger one. Yeah? So that's the publicness of it. So whenever there is a problem, make a larger one, such that the different views that will not consent with regard to the solution of the problem can coexist. No? All the factors. It's not just a question of the views. It's not that there's an objectivity of the problem and people who don't see it right. No, so the other side of the physics of such a communicational physics is that things are much less decided in their development than a particular model of rationalization would say. And but then at the same time, it is crazy. So it needs a bit of, it's a weird thing, no? So on the one hand, this all goes to a valuing of the publicness of knowledge, but it appears that in order to get there, one needs to become almost monastic first, because one needs to think about these things like the angel. No, one doesn't need to pick the angels on the needle. There are plenty of other things to think with. But it's something that cannot immediately say what it's useful for. But this is a bit, so that's why I like to speak very much in terms of literacy, because a literacy is not a skill or a technique. A literacy transforms you. Remember when you learn to write A's and B's and C's and D's for at least 1 year, no? It's super painful. And you cannot imagine what it will ever be useful for. But once you master it, your life is totally changed. And that's the kind of thing with mathematics. We need a kind of, we speak of coding literacy or also quantum literacy to relate to physics again. And it's a literacy first. It needs really to be interiorized. But once you have it, things that are totally complicated for a lot of other people, they are clear. You can help, you can solve problems, no problem. But you don't need to study problem solving in order to solve problems. So that's perhaps the outlook to you. So it might appear as if it tries to turn away from the face of the social reality, but it's the opposite. But in order to turn to, there needs to be not just an agitation. We need a concentration and even a sophistication as well.
Thank you. That's a rather hopeful answer.
Okay, so maybe we have time for one more question and then wrap it up for tonight. Is there anybody else who wants to ask or add something to the conversation? It appears that no, for now. And Vera, you must be exhausted, so we're closed for today, all right? Okay. Tomorrow we'll have another talk. You might be confused by the website because it's tomorrow's talk is in the last cluster, in the third cluster, but the date is tomorrow. So Willow Worker will talk tomorrow at the same time, so 6:30 p.m. European time, Central European time, 12 Eastern time, US Eastern time. So I'll see you, hopefully all of you or some of you tomorrow, or new faces. Until then, thanks again, Vera, and see you soon.
As well. See you soon. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thanks, bye.